So we're going to be tackling Romans 13 today, especially the in this video the first half of it. This section here is kind of was a big deal for my life. It kind of changed some of the course of my life. Part of it, I was in when I was in high school, I decided to go to seminary. And I kind of off and on pursued that through college, and then in the end, I did go to seminary to be trained to minister. And I ended up there in the fall of 2001, and that's when 9/11 happened. And while I was there, we had all these debates about I took mostly the theological classes and stuff like that, but they weren't really helping me figure out a good answer to some difficulties I had. They were they focused like on debates about Calvinism or the inerrancy of Scripture, stuff like that. But I had there were things happening in the world. We were at war, and how the church should respond to the state of your country being at war. Uh, I, I the one didn't feel I was getting adequate answers. On the one hand, towards like say the Christian left or pacifism and all that, like okay, don't kill, turn the other cheek. Maybe we shouldn't be doing politics at all. That was one idea on the side of this kind of cluster. It didn't really seem to satisfy. It was like a withdrawal from the world kind of issue. And then on the other hand, you had a lot of Christians that were like, no problem, whatever, you know. And but those they tended to kind of come out shallow too. And so it kind of drove me that the answers I want to do kind of drove me back to LSU where I'd gone as undergrad and to something I just had like a very minor field of my study, which is political philosophy, drove me to get a master's degree in that to to kind of answer questions that this very passage brought up. The passage we're going to look at today is about the clearest teaching that the Bible has on politics, and it's going to be politics that's not going to let you like be like an American Republican or Democrat or anything in particular like that. It will tend to be politics, a political thing that will work in the Roman Empire, and the timelessness of it is also is like it's better than just working in the Roman Empire, but it'll help you through like say a Renaissance Italian city state or a medieval German state or a kingdom, or it'll tell you how to be Christian in an underground church in North Korea. It's supposed to like it's got to be bigger than just its context and our context. And so we're gonna have very general principles coming from this one, and it's gonna be a little tough to restrain myself on this, but I'll do my best. So this passage is in the broader swath of principles that Paul sets up uh, after his main argument's over. Romans 1 through 11 is one big argument. And then he has like two verses, Romans 12, 1 and 2, that kind of are kind of the thesis that everything following kind of falls from. So what I want you to do today is it'll be a little different. I want you to go back and read Romans 12, 1 and 2, and then read Romans 13, 1 through 7. And so that'll be your context is to go skip back a notch to kind of see the main idea statement before we get going. So pause and do that now. That's 12, 1 and 2, and then 13, 1 through 7. Okay, welcome back. So Paul, remember, says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, and this is your spiritual act of worship. Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, was good and acceptable and perfect. And so this is like, why would we live our lives in the way we're about to see in Romans 13? It's to be a living sacrifice. That's going to be the ultimate motive for this, is how we present ourselves as good and holy to God. So we get over here, this passage, and there's a couple more kind of your sort of main raw material for trying to figure out politics and Christianity. So let's kind of get a little context for this one. First off, when he's talking about earthly authorities in this passage that we'll read up and work our way through in a second, he's not talking about any earthly authorities in particular. He's talking actually about an extreme outlier. So it's not easy to wiggle out of this one. So you can't be saying, well, you know, if earthly authorities are good, it's fine. The earthly authority he's writing to the church in Rome after they returned to a Jewish community that had just returned to Rome. The Jewish Christians had joined Gentile Christians. We know they're both in this audience. So that means Claudius is dead, which means Nero is the Caesar. Who, if you know any Roman history, you know Nero is not on the nice guy list. And so when Paul says submit to earthly authority, it's not like, well, when we like them. It's very much, we're not going to, in the context, you're not going to be able to evade it. Now, on the other hand, at this point, Nero hadn't made moves against the church. Paul dies in the moves against the church, and he's still alive writing this, so we know that hadn't happened yet. He and Paul has had fairly good experience with Roman officials. Many times in his career, a riotous mob was coming after him, and the Romans had the government had actually protected him. So he knows that flesh and blood solutions to the world's problems aren't the solutions, and that's something that's going to haunt this. Jesus is the solution, and his kingdom is not of this world. That's one of the key things to take from the Gospels for politics. But this is like something that he's like, okay, well, they haven't done him too much harm at this point. So sometimes some interpreters will kind of assume that Romans are hunting Christians at this point. They actually aren't. That hadn't happened yet. So that might be in his head. As on the other hand, so on the one hand, you got Nero's authority, kind of an extreme outlier bad guy. On the other hand, we haven't had like a government persecution yet. So those are kind of your historical mitigating factors on this one. So the other passages you probably want to pay attention to, kind of in your head and hold it, is anything the rest of the Bible talks about politics. Kind of few and far between, but one would be the general Sermon on the Mount ethic, like which if you go to Matthew 5 and read far from there, it's a very this worldly kingdom that Jesus preaches, and one that has turning the other cheek as a part of it. You have a passage where Jesus is asked if it was right to pay taxes to Caesar, and he holds up a coin and he says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," and it's Caesar's name and images on that coin, and render unto God what is God's. That's actually a little more ambiguous statement than it sounds. It sounds like, okay, pay your taxes, and the one has nothing to do with the other. But the coin actually had things that belong to God on it, like it said Caesar is Lord, when only Jesus is Lord, and it had a graven image on it, which you're not supposed to have, and stuff like that. They had some complexity to it there. You have the idea that his kingdom's not of this world. You have repeated warnings in all his parables, kind of in code, if you read them in context, that are like, judgment is coming. A lot of the judgment passages of reading gospel are about his audience right there, the Jews in Palestine, who have two choices behind them with the Roman Empire, and Jesus is saying neither of them are good. And Jesus' disciples, you had Simon the Zealot, who is a revolutionary, and you had Matthew the tax collector, who is, you could say, is like the collaborator. And both of them were called out of those jobs because they're not suitable to a disciple of Christ. The collaborator with the powers of this world isn't the right answer, but the resistor of the powers of the world, the revolutionary, really isn't it either. He's doing something else. And so, because we're doing something else, one thing we're going to kind of see here is the church doesn't necessarily particularly need politics. All right, so let's dive in and kind of line by line through this thing. So it says in 13:1, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Period. Now it says, this is like, be subject, submit yourselves to earthly authority. And he's saying because God put those authorities in their place. And so I've heard, on the one hand, like, I've had, like, if you try to be provocative and you say, well, I mean, the American revolutionaries, they weren't submitting to earthly authority. I've heard people say, well, no, this is really about, just obeying the law, like speeding. It doesn't cover, like, something as big as American Revolution. And then you can use the same passage to confront somebody about speeding, And they would say, well, no, that's not really about that. It's about not being a revolutionary. The truth is, it says submit to earthly authority, and I think that includes the sort of top to bottom, because those authorities are put there by God. And that's a theme running through the Old Testament, that the authorities on earth are there by God. They just don't always know it. Like Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel gets his power from God, and he has to acknowledge it eventually. And when they don't acknowledge that their authority is from God, they get God, that's where God judges them. But it's up to God to do that. So their authority comes from God. And we see that several times with non Christian kings in the Old Testament doing that. And Paul's here saying to this church in Rome, in the hub of worldly power of his time, this authority, God allows it to be there. And while it's there, submit yourselves to it. It is something God put there. Now, what is this? This gets a little more complicated as we go later. So you can kind of see in, say, the Protestant Reformation, you have sort of sometimes what you might call it quietism, where it's like, well, we just do everything the government says. We never do anything there. And you have a very strong tradition of that, maybe in the Lutheran tradition. That Martin Luther wrote a denouncement called Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants, kind of famous little document if you teach history like I do. And where he says, rebellions are coming as God, and so it's okay for the state to slaughter them all. I don't know if you quite get to this. You also have another issue kind of like cooking there. It says submit to earthly authority, but there is a sort of like, in this context here, we don't know what to do if we happen to end up being the earthly authority. So it says submit to earthly authority. You're not in charge here. Follow him while you can. Render him Caesar. But it doesn't tell you how to be Caesar. So we kind of have a couple crises in Christian history uh, with regard to politics, because the Bible doesn't. I would say the Bible anticipates miraculously some of this, but on the other hand, it doesn't, in its context, speak to it directly. So when kings start becoming Christians, so the very first one in history was Armenia, but not long after that, you had Constantine the Great become a Christian. And then Constantine quickly gives power to the church. He lets bishops take, like the local church leaders in different cities, take over government affairs. What do we do if we get given that power? And so one of your first big thinkers of what to do with that was a guy named Augustine the Hippo. He wrote a giant book called The City of God, which is pretty much grappling with this very issue. So that's one of them, crises, and kind of the follow-up ones of that. Then you have a second one that you might want to think of is, what about when it's complicated on what the rightful authority is? So think of, and this is sort of grappling with our modern politics. This is more applicable to us because most of us are not born into power, but we're born with like voting rights. So do we fight for our voting rights against an intrusion of it? Because in that aspect, we are the authority. So do we fight to uphold that? And this passage doesn't quite give us answers on this. Just so you know, you kind of have to think around the Bible to get to these. And at some point, I hope to make videos of some of the better thinkers on that. But right now, we only got this passage, and I'm going to tell you, there's not a magic passage that just tells you what it is. When you're trying to come up with answers on politics and Bible, you got Sermon on the Mount, you got this guy, you got rendering into Caesar, and then after that, you're kind of grasping at little details, and they get a little tougher. So let's get back to the text. So it says, there's no authority except for God, and that those that exist have been instituted God. Therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist merit judgment. So if you resist the authority on earth, you resist something God let happen, and you will incur judgment. And it's actually very much like this authority isn't going to put up with you resisting them. If they smack you down, you're getting smacked down as a rebel. You're not getting smacked down as a Christian. I think that's actually an important thing. And it's like, if you're being a living sacrifice, you don't want to get smacked down for any reason other than being a Christian. Your life doesn't belong to your political ideas. that are separate from your faith. It only belongs to Christ. So you don't want to like the resisting is you don't want to encourage judgment. It's like you can't go around and saying God told me to do this particular thing. It's like the judgment's coming from the rebellion, not from anything else, and that's not being a living sacrifice. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So if you're doing the right thing, you don't really have much to worry. And I actually, there are times in my life, I was a little bit of a speed demon when I was a high schooler, and I kind of backed off on it, and then it kind of went overkill a little bit. Went slow and kind of, I think, balanced out in the end. But in there was a point where I was like, when I was speed demon, I was always like head on the swivel looking for cops, especially if I was on the road, and because I had to fear earthly authority because I was rebelling against earthly authority. Then at some point I decided, you know what? I'm going to set my cruise control on trips and stuff at the speed limit, which I'm sure annoyed some people around me. But it was just like when I did that, my head didn't have to be on a swivel anymore. If I wasn't doing anything wrong, I didn't have anything to fear. Having been a sort of petty earthly authority, I run an aftercare program for middle schoolers, so y'all know. When you see kids, like, I kind of look at them like kind of meerkatting, kind of looking around. For me, the sort of petty authority in the place, um, if they have something to fear from me, that's it's probably because they're doing something wrong. If they're not doing anything wrong, they probably don't have anything to fear from me. And not that I'm gonna be terribly harsh, but I mean it's like that's the thing. If you're not doing anything wrong, what are you worried about? And he's saying that's sort of your baseline. Now, the kind of this feels kind of un-American, feels very compliant, and it's a challenge to that. But it's also like if it's these things, if they're just laws, you should do it. Now, one of the we'll kind of give you some answers on the back end of this. There, so it says, would you have no fear of the one in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. So if you do the right thing, you're probably going to do all right, and that's still mostly true most places. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So if you get punished because you did wrong, it's not the world being unjust to you. It's not everything going wrong. It's because you did something wrong. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer, to basically restrain the wrongdoing of the world. That's not even if the guy's a good guy and yours is not a good guy. It's that it is gonna be what happens. God allows that power to exist in the world to restrain the full impact of sin. So sort of like the point of government is to sort of restrain the wrongdoers. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience, because God has that restraint in place there. So it's not if you rebel for the sake of rebelling, which sometimes you have wired up and need to do, and you sometimes have to work that through. It's not being a living sacrifice. Then that's what you get for doing the rebellion. But if you want to avoid God's wrath, being turned over to the consequences of your own sin, remember back to Romans 1 what God's wrath looks like. It says you got to do it that way. Not only that, because this is of conscience, because this is the right thing to do. For because of this, you also pay taxes. kind of it's annoying. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. They're policing, and then you money to police. So that's why you do it. Pay to all what is owed, and this will be the theme that this passage that transitions to the next group. Pay to what is owed, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to revenue is owed, respect to respect is owed, honor to honor is owed. So this also would apply to like these sort of smaller authorities in your own life, like parents and teachers and bosses. Uh, if we have a hard time with those people because we're doing the wrong thing, God doesn't say He blesses that. In fact, He's the opposite. You're picking to dwell in His wrath and your sin and rebelliousness. Your rebelliousness is the problem, not your boss. Until you actually get along with the boss or try to get along, you don't know if it's your fault or their fault. So that's kind of be in there. You see this going all the way in Ephesians, and this is a hard one, where he gives advice to slaves. He says, "Obey your masters, not just um, by eye service, like when they're watching, but also from the heart, so that he might win them over." Now, there's all sorts of things undermined. It's not saying all these things are good. It's not saying, but it is. This is tough. Like it doesn't tell you how do you resist a tyranny. It doesn't tell you some of that. So in general, though, this is our baseline. So we don't want to go in with the acceptance that that I'm the self part where you're not a living sacrifice is going to get you the wrong answers on the exceptions of this. So there might be exceptions to this behavior of always submitting to earthly authority. But if it's like you're speeding just because you want to speed, if you're breaking law just because you want to break law, if you're defiant because you like defiant, there is no the right thing in that. So sometimes we celebrate that, being a rebel and all that, like a Tom Petty song. Um, Here, though, it's saying that's not what we don't rebel for the sake of rebellion. In fact, it's probably only by grace rebelling because we know we're going against God's order on earth. And so it have to be one of those things like where is the rightful authority? It would have to be one of these things like I know it's an evil I'm doing, and I have no idea because not doing something is also evil, and that you're in that bind, and that you're not doing it for self, you're doing it for selflessness reasons or selfless reasons, and you're also doing it with great introspection and fear and trembling and a lot of self doubt and soul reflection that maybe you're not, uh, maybe you are going too far, and it still doesn't tell you what to do if you're the one that's in charge. You gotta have to have maybe the whole Bible shaping your heart if you actually end up being in charge and you want to do it in a Christian way. It's not going to be just this passage. This is more like what to do for the vast majority of us that aren't particularly in charge. So this passage is kind of a lot. It's kind of tough, and it kind of almost feels un-American. I mean, we're born in the American Revolution. We're born not paying taxes to who they were due on the surface. The way you maybe have to reason around it is like maybe if those taxes were unjust, then maybe that is right. But I'm sure it's not always done in the right way because we don't have that kind of expectation in this world. So we want to make sure our ethical moral compass point comes from the fact that our kingdom's not of this world in any way we do it if we're acting as a Christian. So I got to call it at some point. So I'm going to say that's it for this passage. Thanks.